Hello, everyone, and welcome after your short break. I hope you had a productive virtual networking session. For those who have just joined us today, my name is Zosia Vanat, and I'm an agriculture and food reporter at Politico. I'm pleased to welcome you to our next panel during the conference, and the title of the panel is Redrawing the Agri-Food Trade Map. So before we begin, just some logistics. You probably all know already that you can submit your questions to our panelists via the Politico app. So please do so. I will try to take as many questions as possible at the end of the panel. You are also all welcome to tweet about the conference and this particular session. And our hashtag is Politico Agri-Food. You can see it here as well. There is also one more option how you can engage with us today virtually. There is an audience poll also in the Politico app. So you can see the question there and decide to engage by answering the question. And the question for this panel is, what's the biggest challenge in trade relations between the EU and its partners? And we will see the results of the poll after the panel. So now let's kick off with our discussion to discuss the topic of the trade of agri and food goods in the world. We're having some excellent speakers with us today. So let me welcome and introduce John Clark, Director of International Affairs at DG Agri at the European Commission. Hello. Marion Jansen, Director at the Trade and Agriculture Directorate at the OECD. Hello. Ambassador Justin Brown, Australian Ambassador to the European Union, NATO, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Hello.
Morning.
And Ted McKinney, Undersecretary of Agriculture for Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs at the US Department of Agriculture. Hello.
Good morning.
Perfect. So let's start our discussion. We've seen the growing number of challenges between the EU and its trading partners, from the coronavirus pandemic through growing global protectionism, ending with Brexit. So given all these obstacles, John, I think I'm going to start with you. Can you just tell us a little bit how the current outlook of the trade in agricultural goods in the EU looks like? Is it like super grim, or maybe not that grim?
In the short term, fairly grim. In the medium term, I think we can be more optimistic. It's true that 2020 has been the most difficult year in my memory for trade in general and for agri-food trade in particular. COVID has, depressed demand, changed consumer preferences, hit some sectors very, very hard in Europe and I think around the world. The WTO is still in serious difficulties, and there's a wave of protectionism sweeping many countries, and of course the continued US-China frictions and difficulties has a knock-on effect, and we're often collateral damage in those trade skirmishes. I think the lessons that we're learning are from COVID in particular. However, and this is why I'm optimistic for the future, is that the agri-food system has been essentially fit for purpose. The health crisis did not lead to a food security crisis. There was a shock to demand, but not to supply. In Europe, and I think in most parts of the world, food got to the markets. Markets stayed open. We and others in the WTO and FAO were very clear to say that we must resist any efforts to introduce protectionist measures or export restrictions or import restrictions. And by and large, most of the world has avoided that. So the sector's been quite resilient, and that gives me a lot of hope for the future. We've also learned that we need to diversify. One of the lessons that we learned in Europe from the the Russian ban of a few years ago is that it's very dangerous to put all your eggs in one basket, whether it's in terms of your markets or whether it's in terms of your source of supply. So diversification and maintaining trade open and markets open, underpinned by rules, is the solution. There will certainly be a place, and probably a greater place in the future, for more local purchasing, local consumption. The public want that, but in the end, we depend on open trade for our food security. And food security and food self-sufficiency are not at all the same thing. It's almost an oxymoron. Going forward, our own trade policy will be. It's not going to change radically. We will continue to try to implement and enforce the very big network of 80 free trade agreements we have around the world, which covers more than a third now of our agri-food trade. We will continue to pursue new free trade agreements, including with Australia, and we'll have a bigger emphasis on enforcement of the trade rules by our partners. So we have a lot of barriers at the moment to markets, and we will continue seeking reform of the WTO, or perhaps I should say reform of some of the members of the WTO, to try and have stronger rules on transparency, on export restrictions, and ultimately on agricultural support systems. So we will plough ahead with our trade agenda, in the expectation that the times will improve in the next year or two. The demographics in the long term are very positive. Emerging economies, a lot of demand, particularly for the kind of high quality, sustainably produced things that Europe has a good reputation for. So in the long term, we are quite optimistic. And I think the OECD FAO Outlook report on that came out in July is also fairly bullish for the medium term.
Perfect. Thank you so much, John. And I would like to jump to Marion because and ask you the same question, really, but from the more global perspective. I know that you've been researching on that as well. So how does the current outlook for global trade in agri-goods look like from the OECD perspective?
Thank you for that, and thank you for having me with you. I would like to pick up a term introduced by John. I think the system has shown to be fit for purpose, and that has maybe been above all the case because of changes that were introduced and awareness that has been raised in the context of the previous crisis, 2007-2008 recession. The year has nevertheless been tough for us at OECD, partly because, of course, a lot of our work had to focus on the COVID-19 reaction. So the two reports we published in July, our OECD FAO Agricultural Outlook and our Agricultural Policy Monitoring and Evaluation Report, they had a strong focus on COVID-19. So when I said we've seen that the system has been fit for purpose, I'm really thinking of two aspects. First, after the crisis 10 years ago, a system of information sharing, I'm thinking of AMIS, Agricultural Market Information System, has been introduced that allows countries to monitor what is going on in agricultural markets in terms of policies, but also in terms of availability of stock. And we believe that this existing system has played a major role in avoiding panic and negative policies that could have lead to vicious circles in policy making. We have been able to avoid this during this crisis, we believe, very much because of the transparency and the information we had, and in particular because it was possible to create trust in the system and to convince participants that food was available. There was no shortage, partly because of good harvests in several important products, but transparency and accessibility to information has shown to be crucial during this period. So that was one aspect. The other aspect is that, yes, we have seen many countries intervene in the agri-food markets during many countries, many governments, I want to say, during the COVID-19 crisis. But we consider that up to 1/3 of those policies are actually policies that can be beneficial in the long run, even if when we are out of this crisis. Only 10% are policies that we consider could have negative effects and that definitely have to be temporary and cannot stay in place. So there seems to have been a conscious policy making that was designed to assist during the crisis, but not to create negative spillover effects. And that has, from our point of view, been relatively successful. So yes, a difficult year, but very positive signals from the way agri-food markets have been handled during the crisis.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And now, Ambassador Brown, can you tell us how the situation looks like from your perspective, from Australia? Is it as grim as John said, or is it a little bit better? How does it look like?
I think we share much of John's analysis. Our agriculture sector has also been quite resilient during the pandemic. There have been some parts of the sector that have been quite hard hit by we're an island, obviously, geographically far removed from many of our markets. So the disruption in aviation links has impacted some parts of our agriculture sector, and we're very dependent on the agriculture sector, obviously. So that has been difficult for us, but overall, I think we have been pleased that the sector has been quite resilient, and so far, although there's been a dip in growth, it's been relatively strong. I think looking ahead, what we're concerned about is, in a global sense, we're likely to face a long, slow recovery from this. Nobody's really sure what the trajectory will be. There's clearly going to be many governments around the world with very high levels of debt. And we've noticed in some countries the public attitudes or even political attitudes towards open markets, or let's say trade in general, is very mixed. And there's certainly a feeling off the back of the PPE shortages and some of the other concerns at the outbreak of the pandemic. Many governments are under pressure to look at repatriating supply chains back domestically, and we are obviously concerned that might extend beyond medical products and so on into other areas. That's one issue that we think is worrying and would have an impact on the prospects for recovery. And I think the second point, and one that John's mentioned, is the WTO system. I agree with him. The system is in desperate need of revitalisation. If we're going to build back better from the crisis, and if we're going to tackle the kind of things that we all think need to be part of the solution, and here I'm talking about productivity and sustainability, then we do need a proper functioning global governance arrangements. And at the moment, the WTO is centrally important, but it is not performing well for a variety of reasons. So from an Australian point of view, like most middle powers, we're dependent on a multilateral system that functions well, and we are concerned at the moment that the system is in trouble. So we're devoting a lot of effort to trying to turn that around.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And last but not least, Under Secretary McKinney, the same question goes to you. How does it look like from your perspective from the US?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me very much. I appreciate it. And I'll just say that I think there are many themes coming through here. Most of my colleagues started with COVID. I will as well. I think it was a wake-up call, but like the others, I share the view that we, by and large, made it through okay, but with many corrections needed. Some of the discussions over here, I don't know if they'll materialize, is perhaps the need for a bit more processing plants on a more local basis. It's fairly concentrated, so we're hearing that. We clearly, all, I think, around the world saw the value and the need to declare food and agricultural workers as essential. It would have been draconian had that not taken the place, at least here. And so we're grateful for that. And I think we've also learned a lot about the importance of personal protections for employees working in plants of various sorts, people working in farm fields, and the importance of that. And I think the ever-ready presence of personal protective equipment, testing and all those kinds of things is a lesson that we're all learning. But by and large, we were very pleased that there wasn't more trade disruption, more deliberate constraints on food exports. And I'd say the major message that we came away with was that trade must prevail. It is essential that we have trade because we don't know how one country might fare in a pandemic or a horrific weather-related problem or other things. We just don't know. And so trade and the flexibility and the rapid movement of the logistics of trade, I think, really shone through, both in a positive way, but revealed some things we need to work on. I would just add to that, beyond COVID, clearly, I think it's fairly self-evident that we in the U.S., and we're not alone, we're very frustrated and have been with the WTO system, and perhaps with a new executive leader, that will come around and get right-sized, because we do believe in the WTO system. We have to have that, and we find that very much in agriculture. So we too are hopeful that we'll get there. But I would just say that we saw the problems that we have seen with trade existed well before COVID, and those have to be addressed as well. And so I think that comes with not so much the rules of trade, but non-trade barriers. Sanitary, phytosanitary issues would be the good example, rejections of technology, those kinds of things. And so that would not be new. I think that seems to be ongoing, but it's clearly rising even more to a crescendo. And if we do not address it, the world is going to be worse off for it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Pretty much everyone here mentioned the coronavirus pandemic as, the defining sector, at least this year, in the global trade. I would like one message to sort of resonate a little bit more. And you all sort of mentioned that. I just want to specifically ask about those sort of worrying trends, especially in farming and food industry, of those messages from governments that we need to shorten the food supply chain, that we have to produce more locally, that we have to sometimes close our borders. And we've seen that during this year, because we need to have enough food in our own country, so we can't really give this food to other countries. And these are all messages that sort of that could potentially harm international trade. So just to ask again, do you see that as a big threat for the future, or just a tool of mitigating the negative effects of what was happening during this year? And John and maybe Marion, if you could maybe give your thoughts on that.
It's a bit like the famous conversation between President Nixon and Chow En-lai, and Nixon asked Chow En-lai, what do you think was the effect of the French Revolution? Nixon asked that, and Chow En-lai said, well, it's too early to tell. I think on this question, it's a bit too early to tell. My instinctive feeling is that there will not be a serious lapse into autarky or protectionist measures, or very, very serious export or import restrictions in order to reshore and localize food production. Why is that? Because the markets will ultimately decide this, not governments. Yeah, we're all constrained by our rules. There were some half-hearted attempts to do this in the European Union in April. A couple of member states were thinking about introducing export restrictions on cereals. We blocked that immediately. Thank God we have a single market that makes those activities illegal and unwarranted. So I'm not super worried about this. There is a natural feeling coming from the consumers, from the public. They want to know where their food comes from. I think in Europe, many members of the public feel instinctively more comfortable if they can buy food locally for reasons of traceability or even patriotism. But the reality is that will only ever be that can only increase to a limited extent. We are very dependent on exports and imports. We're not self-sufficient and don't wish to be. We're the world's biggest exporter of agri-food, and we want to keep it that way. And we depend on this for our lifeblood. So certainly in Europe, you will not see any significant reshoring or development of local consumption. It's something we do anyway under the CAP, but we depend on trade for much of our agricultural economy.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Marion?
I again pick up on a point made by the previous speaker. It is important for policymakers to transmit this trust to consumers, trust in the system, because consumers do not only want to know where food comes from, they want to know that food will be there when they need it, and that PPEs will be there when they need it, and that pharmaceuticals will be there when they need it. They need to believe this, even without understanding completely the system. And if anything, I believe that the agri-food markets have signaled during this crisis that with right information systems in place, with good policy reactions, which in this case, which means not closing your borders, we can maintain stability in markets and we can transmit this trust. Those markets did not collapse. On other markets, reactions was not that positive. Now, when it comes to can we create more stability by reshoring, our analysis shows very clearly that this is not the case. It's the opposite. If you force significant reshoring upon the private sector, what you will get is lower levels of welfare, lower levels of GDP, and higher fluctuations. So less stability, because whenever there is a shock at home, you will not be able to buffer that off. So there a very clear finding from our work that in too much onshoring or imposed onshoring is not going to be the right thing. What we do see is that the private sector has been reshoring more. Value chains have been shortening over the past decade, very much as a reaction on the financial crisis and some climatic events in Asia notably. And the private sector does this based on their own thorough risk assessment policies, and they actually were also quite prepared to react to the COVID-19 crisis. So I think our understanding is that for 80% of the shock they could manage with their own risk management systems in place. There's only a part they couldn't handle. So we believe that it's important to transmit that policymakers know how to manage crisis, and if anything, the agri-food market has been a good example of this during this crisis.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And as you've all just said, like the international trade hasn't stopped because of all those obstacles and challenges. And also the EU is in talks with many countries, and we are having the representatives of some of these countries today with us. So I would like to take this opportunity to ask both Ambassador Brown and Undersecretary McKinney on, what's the latest in the talks with the EU? What's from your perspective? And what do you see as challenges here now? Ambassador?
The challenges. Well, we have been in negotiations for about 2 years. We're actually today have just finished the 8th round of negotiations. We and the EU side share the same vision, I think, for what we are trying to do here. We want an ambitious deal and a comprehensive one, not just because that commercially makes sense, but also we want to use the deal to actually generate growth and employment opportunities, trade and investment opportunities for both sides. Also, the deal is important as a way of demonstrating our shared commitment to rules-based trade. There's many areas where Australia and the EU have a shared perspective on standards. We've talked a little bit about non-tariff barriers. Many of those need to be dealt with at the multilateral level, but in the bilateral context, there's an opportunity for two systems with similar values to take a pathfinder approach and actually start to look at what we can do bilaterally that might create inspiration for multilateral solutions. So we're coming at this with that type of attitude, and I'm fundamentally optimistic that we can get to an agreement. But first of all, the EU and the UK need to sort out their future relationship, and I won't say anything more on that topic.
Okay, so first Brexit, then the deal. Yes. And under Secretary, can you tell us a little bit more, how does it look like from your perspective? What are the main challenges right now in the trade talks between the EU and the US?
Sure. Well, let's start with some things where we are very aligned. I mean, we did a tiny deal. I think we'll be selling a bit more seafood, notably lobster, to them. And I think we're buying some commercial kinds of things, not so much agriculture. So let's celebrate a baby step there. That's good. And I also think in many ways we share a similar vision on the importance of sustainability. We define sustainability as strong attention and doing right by the environment. We also have the social aspect. That's the second of three legs. And finally, the economic, which to us means let the farmer and to some degree the process thereafter be profitable. And so I think we share the overall goal. I think tactically we're at completely opposite ends, and I am not optimistic. I think it started when the EU wanted to do a deal with the US, but automatically said, we're not going to deal with ag. Ag's out of the picture. And of course, that's a non-starter with our Congress and so many others. So that set the tone, unfortunately. And we've had a real frustration, not with the goals of the precautionary principle, but with the practical implementation. It has caused great harm around the world and has caused for a massive rejection of technologies, the technologies that are going to be needed to address hunger and famine in coming years. So those have been out there. Now with Farm to Fork, I think it's been made worse. I really think this is at an impasse now, and so we'll have to address that. And that's why I meant what I said. I think we'll work through COVID just fine. I think there's a real willingness to make sure that borders stay open, but the business of whether you're even allowed to trade, we've been flat in our sales to Europe for 6 years, 7 now, not for lack of effort, but for some reason, SPS issues creep in and all of a sudden, one market, one commodity gets shut down and then some others. So we've got to seriously sit down and understand it. And I've got some suggestions on Farm to Fork, some positive accolades for them, but also some things that are probably, in our view and much of the world, non-starters.
Perfect. Can you tell us like a couple of your suggestions? Maybe
Sure.
the negative ones.
If you're speaking of Farm to Fork, we love the idea of some of the things involving set aside. We have done this for 20 to 30 years in land that is okay for farming, but might be better left in pasture or in some sort of set aside, put into trees and so forth. We've been very successful at that and upped that just a little bit. Now it can be expensive on a per hectare or per acre basis. So get ready to open the pocketbook. But for those specific areas, it's been very, very successful. I think the area of soil tilth and soil health and restoring and maintaining organic matter, we've been doing a lot there on our own farm. And in my previous role as the state director of ag, I absolutely loved what was going on with the advent of more and more and more cover crops. This is the crop planted right at harvest that would take up any excess fertilizer that might have been there. There's not much we're finding. Make sure the soil stays and doesn't run off with winter rains and winter snows. And so those things are very, very positive. It's the bans on things like pesticides and nutrients that are just so problematic. And the idea is not wrong, but the implementation. For example, let me take my own farm. We have reduced our use of pesticides, notably insecticides, by more than the EU has as its goal. But we did not do it through ban, we did it through innovation and technologies. The same with fertilizer, because we have geopolitical or geospatial satellite imagery and have plugged all the soil data into the computer, and the computer runs the sprayers, we have found a reduction in that, in fertilizers as well. And so I think we're setting up for a battle royale if those aspects of farm to fork go. And we've already heard from a number of countries around the world. Some 35, I think, have written to the EU about this misguided approach. So the goals are laudable. We like that. We would agree there's a lot of common bond, but the implementation, at least 2 or 3 areas, are just, again, non-starters.
Undersecretary John, I have a feeling you would like to reply to this.
Well, I'm condemned to reply, I think, on 2 points. First of all, Ted, you mischaracterized the agreement between President Trump and President Juncker of 2 years ago. They agreed explicitly, jointly, not to include agriculture in any trade negotiations. In the same breath, they agreed not to include GIs, Buy America, or the Jones Act in any trade negotiations. That was so it was not the EU saying no to agriculture. It was an agreement on both sides to have a package which would exclude those particular sensitivities on both sides. So just to put the record straight about that. On the issue of farm to fork, I'm frankly, quite surprised and disappointed at how negative the US is about what we are proposing. I can only assume that because the US administration is in denial about climate change, you cannot embrace some of the objectives that we've set for ourselves in the farm to fork strategy. The strategy is aimed at making farmers more environmentally aware, more protective of the environment, and more economically productive and viable to keep rural areas alive, which I think we both share. I don't apologize at all for our objective to increase our area of organic production by 3 times in the next 10 years. Organic farming is good for the environment, good for the soil, and it's good for the farmer's pocket because there's massive demand. And I don't think we need to apologize for the fact that we want to reduce, not ban, reduce the incidence of toxic pesticides used in farming and excessive fertilizer use. We're not banning fertilizers. We're proposing to reduce fertilizer use by 20%, using the same modern technology, the geospatial monitoring technology, etc., that we use in many parts of Europe and which you're using on your farm. And I could go on. I think it's quite a reasonable objective also to reduce the use of antibiotics in animals because we know the risks for animal health if they are overused and the risks for human health. So I think all of these aims are noble and have a good basis in science and will respond to what consumers and the public expect from their governments. The farm to fork is about the fork and not just the farm, I would add. So we will be taking measures to reduce food fraud, measures to give consumers much more information so they can make informed choices about what kind of food they buy. We're not going to be telling consumers what to eat, but we will give them informed information so they can make intelligent choices about their diets. And we have a target also to reduce food waste by 50% by 2030. That is in line with the UN SDGs. And again, I think that's something that we feel quite strongly about. I would really hope that going forward, you could reappraise this strategy. It's not legislation, it's a strategy with many, many strands. And we could work together because I think, coming back to your first point, Ted, I think our basic objectives in this one planet that we're trying to protect are the same.
Thank you so much. I believe we could go on and on with this discussion, and there would be many more interesting thoughts. But Unfortunately, our time is up now. So I would like to thank to all our speakers. I think that's been very interesting and enriching debate. And to all of those who are watching us online, thanks for being with us. And we would like to invite you for a 30 minutes lunch break, during which you can all also network virtually with other people online. So take advantage of that. Thank you so much, and join us again at 1 p.m. Thank you.